recording era. Erev Tov, everyone. Shabbat Shalom and almost Shavua Tov. This is a very special night, and thanking Boris and Carol for their presentations, thanking Cantor Nami for his music to come, thanking all of the committee for organizing this, thanking Aliza for putting this all together. It is a pleasure to learn more in our community. To begin, we have Havdalah, separating the Shabbat from the rest of the days of the week. And when we observe Havdalah, we are often quite reluctant to see it go. The beauty of the day of rest is something we say farewell to with much difficulty, and yet that's the way the world is going to rotate, and the sun will disappear, and we will be in the next day. Not only that, but we enter this new month of Elul with the great hopes for a good new year in the future. But this is the time of thinking about how we move forward in our lives with repentance and with apology and with reconciliation and with bettering our relationships. So there is much on our minds now as we now enter this month of Elul. Tomorrow is the first of Elul. Today was the 30th of Av, and we celebrate these 2 days really of Rosh Chodesh this year in this way. But Havdalah we have here as well. And Cantor, I think we begin with music to bring us to this moment.
And I'm putting a link in the chat if you want to try to access the text. This is from the URJ's website for those who wish. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam borei peri hagafen borei peri hagafen.
We praise our God for the gift of the fruit of the vine.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam borei minei v'samim borei minei v'samim.
We thank God for the gift of sweet-smelling spices.
If you have anything nice to smell, go right ahead and, I don't know, whatever you like.
No, that's true. I have mostly cinnamon in here.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam borei meorei ha'esh borei meorei ha'esh.
We thank God for these many wicked candles that allow us to observe this ceremony with light and joy.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam hamavdil bein kodesh lechol hamavdil bein kodesh lechol.
We thank God who allows us to make important distinctions and separations between the day of Shabbat and the new week to come, between that which is holy and that which is unholy.
Eliyahu Hanavi, Eliyahu Hatishbi, Eliyahu, Eliyahu, Eliyahu Hagiladi, Bimhera v'yameinu, Yavo Eneinu, Im Mashiach ben David, Im Mashiach ben David, Eliyahu Hanavi, Eliyahu Hatishbi, Eliyahu, Eliyahu, Eliyahu Hagiladi. Shavua tov, 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 Shavua tov. A good week, a week of peace. May gladness reign and joy increase. A good week, a week of peace. May gladness reign and joy increase.
Shavua Tov, everyone.
Shavua tov.
Carol,
Yes.
we're going to begin with Carol Cantor, who will share about the early part of Ukrainian Jewish history, and I will let you take it from here.
Okay. So can everyone see this image of a slide?
Yeah.
Okay. The early part of Ukrainian Jewish history that I'm going to try to condense into a little more than 15 minutes lasts for quite a long time and is extremely complex. So right away, let's give the main points that you can keep in your mind, and perhaps this is what you come away with. There have always been many Jews in Ukraine. They have experienced anti-Semitism again and again. And despite that, there have been major Jewish religious and cultural innovations that came out of Ukraine. So let me say a little bit about who I am and why I'm doing this. I'm a folklorist and I'm an amateur historian. I've collected oral histories from Jewish and other immigrants when I lived in Cleveland and helped to shape them into texts and exhibits. Also, together with my husband, Paul, I've collected, studied, taught, and performed folk dances from Eastern Europe, the Balkans, and the Middle East. So I'm going to use a lot of maps. And let's get oriented to this first map. It's a satellite view. It shows the large Mediterranean Sea, and above it to the right, the Black Sea, and over to the right of that, the Caspian Sea. I'm also going to use this golden oval to represent roughly the area of Ukraine. And behind it, you see this big purple splotch. And what that purple splotch is a representation of the migration routes that were followed for 4 millennia from people from Asia traveling in toward Europe. And of course, some stopped along the way and some continued. And as a result of that, there's enormous genetic and ethnic diversity in the background of Ukraine. Still, up until about the 15th century, very few of those people were Jews. To show you how important this topic of genetic and ethnic diversity is, this is an image of the Science magazine that arrived in our mailbox today. And it represents artistically a number of serious genetic studies looking at the genetics of the people who traveled through that long purple swatch. So when did the Jews get to be in the area of Ukraine? Here we have a different map. It just shows the Black Sea, but you still see the oval. And you'll notice that it covers a purple area, which is Poland, actually Poland, Lithuania, which was an enormous kingdom, Russia, the green, and here in the gray is the Ottoman Empire. So already at this later time, there are other contributions to the background of the people who lived in Ukraine. Starting in the 12th century, many Jews migrated not from the east, but from the west into this area. And they came out of Western Europe when they were expelled during the Crusades, during the Spanish Inquisition, and during various migrations from the area of the Rhineland in Germany and France. And why did they come here? Well, Poland was a major power at that time, and Poland's leaders tolerated religious diversity. And so 100,000 Jews lived in Poland around the 1600s. Some of them rose to be elite middle-class people. The Polish and Lithuanian rich people owned a lot of land all the way down south into what is today Ukraine. And they couldn't take care of that land, so they hired Jews to be their managers, to collect the taxes. And during the time of the Poland-Lithuania Commonwealth, 50,000 Jews lived in Ukraine. And there, they experienced anti-Semitism, principally from the Eastern Orthodox Ukrainians who were opposing the Catholic Poles. The Jews weren't Catholic, but they were the agents of the Catholic Poles. And so they suffered under this anti-Semitism. In the 17th century, a figure arose who represents a strain of anti-Semitism and violence. And that person is the Cossack Bogdan Khmelnytsky. Cossacks were independent bands of people who lived in what is now the Eastern Ukraine and Western Russia. And they saw themselves as a boundary between the Christian West and the Muslim East. Because they occupied this area of Ukraine and they were very independent, Ukrainians regarded Khmelnytsky as their founder of their nation. And when he conflicted with the Poles, there was violence against the Jews who were taking care of the Polish lands. And that resulted in a massacre in 1648-49, in which 20,000 Jews were killed. Look in the lower right, and you'll see an image from today, where a Ukrainian soldier is shown next to a Cossack in traditional costume. And behind is an image of the map of Ukraine in the colors of the flag. So it's clear that even today, Ukraine is allying itself with this Cossack image. Despite all this, Jews continued to migrate to Ukraine, and they contributed to economic recovery after pogroms and generally promotion of trade. The Russian Empire grew in the 18th century, and by the end of it, the Empress Catherine the Great established what's called the Pale of Settlement. That's this area bounded by the dark line and overlaid is that golden oval that represents roughly the area of Ukraine. This Pale of Settlement was an area where Jews had to live. They could not live out of it, except with certain special permission. 1/3 of the Jews who were living in this enormous area, which goes all the way up to Lithuania, across to Poland, into all of Belarus, 1/3 of them were living in Ukraine. This is an area that suffered tremendous violence and pogroms from Russians, from Cossacks. And this is yet another map that shows that Pale of Settlement and overlaid this oval that represents Ukraine. And all these words are towns where pogroms occurred. They got even worse in 1881 when socialist revolutionaries assassinated the Tsar Alexander II. So why were Jews so hated? Many of them were Russian speakers. They had been educated in schools that taught Russian, and they wanted to know Russian for purposes of conducting business with Russians. However, the Ukrainians saw that Russian language among Jews as collaborating against Ukrainians. So that's a lot of bad news. And I'd like to have some good news to share. And so I have a few slides with this red pomegranate in the corner. And the first piece of good news is to repeat probably what you've heard before, which is that Hasidism arose as a new Jewish movement in the territory of Ukraine. And this is a map from Google Maps today that shows here in red the place where the Baal Shem Tov taught and developed his following. And his notion was that the importance of being a Jew, the most important thing a Jew can do is to pray, to love God and love one's fellow Jews. And these would connect one to God, even if one could not study. This was the first of many other Hasidic dynasties that followed, each identified with its own town. Another major development among Jews occurred in the 19th century with the Enlightenment, or the Havdalah, which originated in the 18th century in German. And this idea was to promote Jewish cultural revival by helping Jews integrate with the wider society, to learn Russian, to learn Polish, to learn secular subjects, science, mathematics, history, in order to be fully citizens of the nations where they lived. In fact, the Reform Jewish movement originated with the ideas of the Havdalah. Also in this time, there was a flowering of Yiddish literature. And here's another map. This is Ukraine, actually today's outline. And each of these little black squiggles that nobody can read really represents a town where a writer in Yiddish was born or wrote or lived. And the third big thing that happened in Ukraine in the 19th century, culturally, is that Zionism arose there. Many Zionist leaders lived there, and Ahad Ha'am, a foremost Zionist thinker, also lived there, and Hebrew poetry was blossoming at that time, and the poet Bialik lived there too. No discussion of Ukraine in the 19th century is complete without talking about Odessa. And here I'm showing an image of 3 women and a little boy. And down in the lower right corner, if you can read Cyrillic alphabet, you see it says Odessa. And here is the name of the photography house, Mulman. Alongside are all the medals that photographer Mulman earned for his beautiful photographs. The woman in the middle is my husband's maternal grandmother, Mindel Steinberg. Here she is with her 2 sisters, the older and her young child, and the younger. The city of Odessa was new. Families like Mindel's family found a non-traditional atmosphere. People could be entrepreneurs, people could be Jewish while also participating in many other things in Odessa. Mindel told her own daughter that when she was a young girl, she was born in 1884. When she was a young girl, she sang with her beautiful voice in church choirs, not Jewish. She and her brother won prizes for dancing. So that gives you an idea of what Jewish life was like in the city of Odessa. In 1906, Mindel and her sisters and her parents came to the United States, and now we are in the 20th century. And this is a time when history becomes real for all of us, because we have lived parts of this history, and we know from our parents and families other parts of this history. So I can't really cover this, but I will have 3 slides, and this is what they're going to deal with: World War I and the Communist Revolution, World War II and Nazis in Ukraine, and persistent Soviet anti-Semitism. So here's another map, and you can see this golden oval around Ukraine, and it's from 1920. This is after the Russian Revolution, but before the Soviet Union. And in 1920, Russia was involved in a civil war. Ukraine saw the opportunity to try to break off and establish their own country before the Soviet Union could form. And in Ukraine, the Ukrainians tried to enlist the help of Jews and promised many things and gave them a voice in a government that was still a fantasy. But the Ukrainians lost to the Red Army, and they didn't provide the Jews any security. And so as a result of that, there were further pogroms due to the failure of the Ukrainians to create an independent nation. And many Jews, approximately 100,000, were murdered in pogroms from 1919 to 1920. And by 1926, 1.5 million Ukrainian Jews lived in the Ukraine. In the 20th century, we all know about World War II, the Nazis, and the devastation of the Holocaust. And what was Ukraine's role? Well, here is this golden oval on the area of Ukraine. And these colored areas represent various levels of German control, including this big tan area in the middle, which is an area where there was bureaucratic control by Germans implemented by Ukrainians. In this period of time, when you come to the end of World War II, the Jewish population of Ukraine, as you can see here, was decimated from 870,000 to 17,000. The 20th century is the Soviet era. These were the years the Soviet Union existed. Throughout these years, Ukraine was intensely anti-Semitic, starting with the Tsarist pressures of anti-Semitism and greatly increased under Stalin in the 1930s. And of course, the local Ukrainians still had their ideas from the Cossack times. And Jews were seen as allied with the Soviet Union against Ukrainian independence. And that was another source of anti-Semitism. Until 1971, Jews were denied permission to leave the Soviet Union, but under Gorbachev in the 1980s, major migrations began. I'm going to leave you in 1991 with the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Here's yet another map, and this is the true area of Ukraine as it exists, as it is being challenged these days by the Russians. I'll be able to answer questions when we're all done at the end. Thank you very much for your attention. Who is the MC?
I think that it might be me. I don't know who the MC is, but I think that it might be me next, if I'm not mistaken. But I don't know how long I have.
Oh, we'll give you minutes.
That's great and so specific. So
7 to 10.
Sure. Okay. So, and I know that I'm gonna have another kind of short block later, and my role here is to give you all a taste of the breadth of Jewish music that we get from the region of the world that is called Ukraine today, that has been, as Carol was taking us through, has had many shifting borders, and a long and complex history. And as long as there have been Jewish communities there has been a rich tradition of Jewish music coming from a variety of different kinds of circles. I would note really three main areas of Jewish life that were incredibly rich in their output of Jewish music. One of them is absolutely the Hasidic movement, starting around, it was mid 18th century, if I'm not mistaken. Carol, you can correct me on any of that history. And there were a number of figures in various Hasidic communities throughout that whole region that were well known for composing melodies, many of which we still know and still use today, and even have attributions to those specific figures. The second area I would say is like what we might call the highbrow synagogue music. And I'm going to talk about that because that's in relationship to a lot of what Carol was sharing with us about Odessa in particular. And then the third area, of course, is the realm of folk and other like folk and secular music, both like Yiddish folk music, but also Jews in Odessa in particular got into other genres like even tango and jazz, though I don't have a way of sharing really as much with you about those particular melodies. So to start us off, I wanted to share with you just a simple nigun to kind of bring us together. This is one that has made its way and spread itself throughout the Reform movement, and it was misattributed for a very long time. It was called the Cane Street Nigun, named after the Cane Street Synagogue in Brooklyn, but the melody actually comes from the region of Ukraine. It was collected by Moshe Beregovsky, who was a incredibly important musicological figure. He was an ethnographer. He collected melodies, and he's one of the reasons that we know as much as we know today about music that comes from this region of the world. And he collected this simple nigun that you will hear in Reform communities across North America today, because it spread like wildfire after it became popular at the Cane Street Synagogue. Yadadalai, dadai, yadadai, dadai, dadai, yadadalai, dadai, 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 yadadai, dadai, yadadai, dadai, dadai, yadadai, dadai, dadai, dadai. Yadadalai, dadai, yadadalai, dadai, yadadai, dadai, dadai, dadai. Yadadalai, dadai, yadadalai, dadai, yadadai, dadai, dadai, dadai. Yadadalai, dadai, yadadalai, dadai, yadadai, dadai, dadai, dadai. Yadalai, dalai, yadalalai, dalai, yadalai, dalai, dalai, dalai. Yadalalai, dalai, yadalalai, dalai, yadalai, dalai, dalai, dalai. Yadalalai, dalai, yadalalai, dalai, yadalai, dalai, dalai, dalai. You can see why that one's gotten around in Jewish communities. Even I would say within the last 5 to 10 years, I've heard it in all kinds of different places, and it was not known until I would say within the last few years that it came from this region of the world. And I'm still trying to figure out more information about its actual origin. I have to get into some of Beregovsky's source material, which I could talk about. That would be a whole other lecture, a whole other thing to talk just about him. Coming to the fact that there's a lot of text and melodies that we know but that we don't know come from this region. We have to talk about Odessa, and we have to talk about how not only was it an intellectual and cultural hub, but it was also a major hub for, I would say, at least the latter two categories of music that I spoke about. The highbrow synagogue music and all of the various secular genres of music that Jews engaged in, including Yiddish folk music, jazz and tango and other kinds of popular music. When it comes to the synagogue music, there were two major synagogues in Odessa. There was, and I'm going to make sure that I have my notes on hand here. There was the Great Synagogue, that was also sometimes called the Shalashna Street Synagogue, and then there was the Brodsky Synagogue. Both of them had powerhouse cantors throughout their history, and they were both what we would call a chor shul, literally a choir synagogue. That it was a style of worship that really elevated the status and prominence and use of choir and choral singing throughout the entirety of the worship, but not like classical reform as we've experienced. Very much still within what we might call an Orthodox idiom, but heavy emphasis on choir. The figures that we hear from these synagogues are people whose tunes we know, but we don't realize where they come from. Avraham Dunayevsky was one of the chief cantors at the Great Synagogue in Odessa, and there are many Jews who sing some of his melodies every single Shabbat in the Torah service. Av harachamim heitiv avirtzonecha et Zion. Not everywhere, but many communities sing that tune. You'll hear that, I think, at our congregation during the High Holy Days. And then the Brodsky Synagogue had two cantors in particular whose melodies show up all over the place, that are sometimes labeled just as traditional. Nisan Blumenthal, who was one of the first cantors of the Brodsky Synagogue in Odessa, wrote the beginning part of the melody that we sing when we return the Torah to the Ark. Eitz Chaim hi lamachazikim ba v'tomche ha'meushar, etc. through Dirachei hadarchei noam v'chol netivotei shalom. And then his melody deviates. The Hashivenu melody that we use came later from another composer. And then his successor, Pinchas Minkowski, was also a prolific composer in his own right. Somebody's asking about Yiddish theater. Well, I was going to get to that later on, maybe in my second block, talking about figures like Mark Warshavsky, who was actually born in Odessa, but studied with Abraham Goldfaden. So, we'll talk about him in a little bit, but I'm only going to be able to give you little bits of each of these because each one of them could be a full lecture and or concert and or both in and of itself. So, talking about the confluence of Hebrew poetry and highbrow music that was existing in Odessa at the turn of the 20th century. Some of you may have noticed that since the war broke out in Ukraine, you've been hearing a lot of me on Friday nights offering a particular poem by Chaim Nachman Bialik, Shabbat HaMalka, with music by Pinchas Minkowski. So Bialik wrote this poem for Shabbat, this beautiful hymn for Shabbat. I'm going to share my screen here. Where did it go? Wrote this beautiful poem for Shabbat around 1903, 1904, and shortly thereafter, Pinchas Minkowski, the cantor at the Brodsky Synagogue, set it to music. So the melody that you would sing, Hachama merosh ha'ilanot nistalka, bo v'neitzeh likrat Shabbat hamalka. And I'm going to change key here so that we can sing it together, just to get it into our voices. Hinei yoredet hakidosha haberucha ve'ima malachim tzva shalom u'menucha boi boi hamalka boi boi hakala Shalom Aleichem Malachei HaShalom. I'm changing some of the emphasis here. What you might not know is that is only the first stanza of a 4-stanza poem. You may recognize the last line of this stanza as the first line of Shalom Aleichem, another song that is sometimes sung on Shabbat. This is the brilliance of a poet like Bialik. If you look at the other stanzas that he wrote, hold on. The last line of the second stanza is the second line of Shalom Aleichem. I'm going to sing a little bit of this for you. Kibalnu pnei Shabbat birnana utfilah Habayit hanashuva belev malei gila Shamaru hashulchan hanerot yairu Kol pinot habayit Yizrachu yazhiru, Shabbat shalom umevorach, Shabbat shalom umevorach, Boachem leshalom, Malachei hashalom. And you would continue, and I'm not going to sing the whole thing right now, but you would hear the next line ending with Barchunu, very similar to Barchuni, Lishalom Malachei Hashalom. And then the final stanza ending with Seitchem Lishalom Malachei Hashalom. That's, again, the brilliance of Bialik, is that he took this other song, this other text that existed, and just expanded upon it. And then you add the beauty of the music of Minkowski, and we get something truly, truly special. So I think I'm probably at time for this block. All of that is to say is that Minkowski wrote prolific music, and he was not alone. The synagogue composers were interacting with the folk poets, and there was such synergy and creativity that existed that we are the inheritors and the beneficiaries of. More to come.
Boris, we invite you to share your screen.
Right. Thank you. Let's see. 1 second. Yeah. Can you see my slides?
Yes, you have a preview of the next slide showing also.
Oh, yeah. As well as my notes?
Yes.
Okay. That's not working correctly then. I thought we tested it and it was supposed to work differently. Then we're having a problem.
Share. Before, when you shared, I saw the full slide first, and then you switched to presenter.
Okay, let's try again. And slideshow. And okay. And we'll try this, and we'll.
And now try switch. Yeah, now we're just seeing the full slide.
And now?
Yes, you're good.
Just the slide.
Just the slide, no notes.
Okay. Okay, that sounds good. Let's see. I need to move. I apologize for the delay. I need to move some of it so that I could. Okay. Okay. We could start. Hello again, everyone, and welcome to part 2 of the Ukraine presentation that will deal with its history from the time it declared its independence in 1991 and to the present day. And it's been a quite troublesome history indeed. While at the moment it's even worse, having become very tragic, as you know. A little bit about myself first. I was born and spent my childhood in the western Ukrainian city of Chernivtsi. It's a very beautiful city with lots of interesting, again, pretty troublesome at times history. For instance, it hasn't always been Ukrainian, as it is situated at the crossroads among major European powers. So throughout the past several centuries, it has belonged to, for example, to the Ottoman and Austro-Hungarian empires, as well as more recently, prior to its annexation by Stalin's Russia in 1940, Romania. And prior to that, it had been a major center of Jewish commercial and cultural life, that had a large and vibrant Jewish community. For my college, I went to St. Petersburg, Russia, another magnificent place, though honestly, I'm currently very hesitant to say a positive word about anything Russian. And from there, I moved to the United States, where my family, immediate family, reunited with some other family living in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, including my grandparents. And then I was able to transfer to the University of Wisconsin to finish my engineering education. A couple of years after which I entered the MBA program at our business school here. And since then, I've been happy to call Madison my home, and have been raising my two children, a boy of 17 now, and girl of 12 here. And I would have a lot of positive words to say about this place, as I'm sure many of you would. But moving on. Ukraine. Let's dive into some of the history. The modern history of the independent Ukraine begins at the end of 1991. On December 1, a couple of months after the Soviet Union collapsed, which in turn, as you may have noticed, took place about a month after I left the country. So I fully attribute the collapse of that mighty empire to that. On December 1st of that year, Ukraine held a referendum in which about 92% voted for its independence from Russia. The country elected its first president, someone by the name Leonid Kravchuk. And in January of 1994, an agreement called the Budapest Memorandum was signed, in which the parties that included Ukraine, the United States, and Russia guaranteed the country's territorial integrity in return to its giving up its nuclear weapons stockpile. And as you understand, knowing the current reality, that was an important milestone agreement that has been grossly violated by one of those signatories. The same year, Ukraine entered into partnership with NATO, supported by most of its population, which also harbored hopes for becoming a full EU member. All of this signifies the desire to move away from the Russian control, both economically and culturally. At the same time, the country, already one of the poorest among the former Soviet republics, experienced a devastating economic crisis. Official GDP collapsed by almost half from 1990 to 1994. And a slow decline continued throughout that decade. The budget deficit was huge, and barter and the use of surrogate monies and foreign currencies prevailed. And a shadow economy swelled and compensated for an unknown share of the economic collapse. And then I think now it would be worth focusing a little more on the economy. Okay. Traditionally, Ukraine is an agrarian country. The breadbasket of the Russian Empire, as it was called and viewed. It possesses a very large share of the most fertile, oops, what is this picture here? Fertile soil though Soviet practices helped Ukraine modernize its mining and metallurgy sectors, for example, They came at a high cost. Its agrarian-based economy suffered hugely from forced collectivization and drive to industrialization. And Ukraine eventually became dependent on oil, minerals, and later relatively cheap gas from Russia. Despite some of those difficulties and setbacks, the country entered the new century with some hopes of revival. The economy picked up, incomes grew, some foreign investment started flowing in. At the same time, the people protested what they perceived quite rightly as corruption within the top echelons of the government, in particular within the office of the then president, Leonid Kuchma, who was suspected of ordering the assassination of a prominent investigative reporter. And the 2004 presidential race pitted Western-oriented Yushchenko, he's seen pictured here, and against Viktor Yanukovych. And Yanukovych was Kuchma's preferred choice and the candidate supported by Moscow. And the election was a tug of war between those who seek closer ties with the European Union, NATO, and the West, and those who favor closer alignment with Russia. And after two flawed rounds of voting, the election was awarded to Yanukovych. But protesters who were dressed in orange, which was Yushchenko's campaign color, took to the streets in large numbers and forced a revote in December, which Yushchenko actually won. In 2006, amid a negotiating dispute, Russia shuts off its gas supplies destined to both Ukraine and through Ukraine to Europe. And 2008, during Ukraine's failed bid for the NATO membership, vehemently opposed by Russia, Putin tells George W. Bush that Ukraine is not even a real nation state. At the same time, Russia invaded another former Soviet Republic of Georgia, and the Ukrainian government sided with Georgia, thus increasing the tension in its relationship with Russia further. In the election of 2010, the pro-Russian Yanukovych narrowly defeated the pro-Western candidate, whom he promptly jailed, which was widely seen as a sign of corruption, and to which the EU nations reacted by withdrawing support for further integration talks. Shortly after that, in 2013, Ukraine canceled the EU talks and instead opted for wider ties with Russia. This led to Ukrainians turning out in large numbers to protest, cutting down the European ties and moving towards Russian integration. Mostly peaceful demonstrations continued for 2 months in Kyiv, main square called Maidan. They turned violent after the government moved to break the protesters, and the resulting crackdown killed more than 100 people. Soon after that, Yanukovych fled to Russia and left behind a lavishly decorated palace, which protesters saw as the evidence of his corruption. Ukraine's new acting president and acting prime minister made it clear that a top priority will be to bring Ukraine closer to Europe. And then, shortly after that, pro-Russian forces, including so-called little green people, who were actually Russian soldiers in Russian uniforms, but with identifying insignia removed, seized control of Crimea, a Ukrainian peninsula where the majority of residents are ethnically Russian. And so soon after that, authorities held a disputed referendum in which Crimean voters chose to secede and join Russia. The West EU and the US called the referendum illegal and illegitimate. And Washington actually promised it would never be accepted. Russia annexed Crimea on March 21st of that year. And the UN General Assembly voted 100-11 against recognizing the referendum result. And Russia is expelled from the group of 8. A month later, Putin actually admitted that the Russian soldiers were involved in the annexation and justified it as a way to protect ethnic Russians allegedly threatened by violence from Kyiv. And of course, this went against both the letter and the spirit of the Budapest Memorandum that I mentioned above. But Putin didn't care, as this boosted his popularity at home, which was in turn helped by the powerful propaganda machine. It also gave Russia full control over the important Black Sea ports and the Russian naval bases, to which Russia had long-term lease anyway, without the annexation. And in April of that same year, Russia provoked an armed separatist movement to seize government buildings across eastern Ukraine's Donbas region. And Ukrainian forces resisted, but were wary of sparking a much wider war because of the Russian troop buildups reported along the border. And by early 2022, fighting has resulted in more than 14,000 deaths, a quarter of them civilians, and 2 million internally displaced Ukrainians. Parts of the two regions, Donetsk and Luhansk, declared themselves independent republics. And in May of 2014, Petro Poroshenko, which is is a pro-West oligarch, actually won an outright majority in the first round of Ukraine's presidential election. And he promised to fix the economy by aligning Ukraine with Europe and to root out corruption that has trailed Ukraine since its independence. The US president of the time, Barack Obama's administration, signaled interest in helping Poroshenko battle corruption and assigned Vice President Joe Biden as its chief envoy for Ukraine. That same year, a Malaysia Airlines flight from Amsterdam to Kuala Lumpur was shut down by a surface-to-air missile over eastern Ukrainian territory, controlled by Russian proxy forces, resulting in the deaths of all 298 people on board. Subsequent Dutch-led investigation later found out that Russia bore responsibility, and the missile was provided by a Russian army brigade, which Russia denied. And then in September of 2015, Russian units entered Ukraine to push back Ukrainian forces that were on the verge of regaining control of the Donbas. And then we could move on because we're running out of time. In December 2017, the United States approved lethal arms sales to Ukraine, moving beyond the non-lethal military assistance that the Obama administration had allowed. That summer, Trump named Kurt Walker as his special envoy for Ukraine negotiations. The US Congress authorized hundreds of millions of dollars of additional military aid to Ukraine. I'll skip some of these parts. We could revisit sometime later or during the Q&A session if we have some time left. In a April of 2019, Volodymyr Zelensky, who a television comedian and political novice with Jewish roots, won a presidential runoff with more than 70% of the vote, defeating Poroshenko. 2 months later, Zelensky's party also won a majority of parliamentary seats. Zelensky had campaigned against corruption and poverty and pledged to end the war in the East. Many saw that as a vote of as a rejection of Poroshenko and his failure to root out corruption. We all remember the infamous perfect phone call. I'll skip that part. In September of 2020, Zelensky approved Ukraine's new national security strategy, which provided for the development of a distinctive partnership with NATO and the aim of gaining full membership. And the previous year, Zelensky's predecessor signed the constitutional amendment committing Ukraine to become a member of NATO and the EU. All of it making the Russians, both in the government and wider populace due to the government-controlled propaganda, extremely unhappy. In April of the following year, officials from Ukraine and EU member states warned about recent Russian deployments near Ukrainian border and in Crimea, adding up to more than 100,000 troops, along with tanks, rocket launchers, and other weaponry. Analysts call it the largest troop buildup since Russia's 2014 annexation of Crimea. And the following month, Putin published an article titled "On the Historical Unity of Russians and Ukrainians," in which he questioned the legitimacy of Ukraine's borders, asserted that Russians and Ukrainians are the same people, one people, and blamed the collapse in bilateral ties on foreign plots and anti-Russian conspiracies. And on February 24th of this year, at 5:30 a.m. Moscow time, Russian state television channels were interrupted to broadcast an address by President Vladimir Putin announcing a special military operation, as they termed it, in the Donbas region. And at the initial pretext, Putin said that Russia sought demilitarization and denazification of Ukraine. And then a full-scale invasion started with air and missile strikes on several cities. And then the main infantry and tank attacks were launched in 4 incursions, creating a northern front launched towards Kiev, a southern front originating in Crimea, and a southeastern front launched in the cities of Luhansk and Donetsk. It was widely expected and reported that by the intelligence experts and media that the initial objective of the war was to swiftly occupy most of the major cities, starting potentially with the capital city of Kiev, where the Ukrainian government was to be decapitated, and a new Russian-controlled puppet administration would be installed. In reaction to that, it was also reported that President Zelensky was offered by the West and the US in particular to be evacuated, to which in act seen as bravery and defiance, he responded, "The fight is here, I need ammunition, not a ride," which, as you know, earned him admiration from much of the world, and I would argue helped to spur many of the governments, as well as private organizations and citizens, to assemble help packages, including in the form of ammunition that he so bravely requested, or rather demanded. And so if the Russian plans did include capturing the capital, as it appears, they failed spectacularly. Thanks, first of all, to the resolve and bravery of the Ukrainian fighters, and also to the cache of weaponry received from the West, mainly the US. Russian troops did approach several of the capital's northern suburbs, along with an airport. But by the beginning of April, they were pushed back and had to regroup in other parts of the country. As the Russian troops withdrew from Kiev, evidence of brutal atrocities started to emerge. Ukrainians found dozens of corpses of civilians scattered on the street or buried in shallow graves in the Kiev suburb of Bucha, and which Moscow dismissed as saying that the images of the bodies were fake. And in March, Russian forces also dropped a very powerful bomb on a theater in the port city of Mariupol, where hundreds of unarmed civilians were sheltering. And it was actually clearly marked with a sign of children present. And of an estimated 1,200 civilians were sheltering inside, and about half of them perished in the attack. And within a few weeks, that large, vibrant, and heavily industrial city was wiped out completely. Skip some of these parts. In the meantime, the West and most of, notably the US and UK, have been supplying Ukraine with an unprecedented amount of military aid, including long-range missiles that have proven extremely effective against Russian command posts and arms depots. It also appears that Russia has Odessa in its eyesight as the major strategic objective, which actually makes sense given the city's the city would provide access to the important transit routes through its ports. However, Ukraine is aware of that importance and is sparing no resources to defend the city. In general, historically, Odessa has proven to be a very tough nut to crack by occupying forces. Of course, inescapably, Jewish people of Ukraine couldn't help but have the tragic stories of their past, some of which we heard featured in Carol's presentation, coming to the forefront of their memories. Some of these pages have fortified Jewish collective memory for centuries, as Jewish identity and the history of these catastrophes became closely intertwined. Yet this moment feels and is very different, as Jewish people have joined their Ukrainian neighbors in resisting Russian aggression and sharing the toll befallen on all people of Ukraine. There are reports of Ukrainians taking refuge in mikvahs and synagogues together with their Jewish neighbors, or about Hasidic Jews taking up arms to defend their country alongside Ukrainian soldiers, all in the face of the common enemy. And in effect, helping eliminate the pre-existing tensions and heal the wounds of the past. And of course, this is also helped by the realization that the country is led by a person of Jewish origins, voted into the office by the overwhelming majority of Ukrainians. And I would add from my personal experience that I could never in the past have imagined such a possibility, having been personally touched by the Ukrainian anti-Semitism throughout my childhood. So there is no question, Ukrainians have come a long way towards the major democratic values of tolerance and pluralism. Which is why Putin's pretext for this war that includes so-called denazification of Ukraine rings completely hollow and ridiculous. Again, from my personal experience, communicating most recently with Ukrainian Jews and non-Jews alike, there is simply no truth to those claims. This image below at the bottom, I took while staying in Kiev 3 years ago for a month on a business trip. And it depicts a school class visiting and paying tribute to the victims of the worst Jewish massacre by the real Nazis at Babin Yar, which is in Kiev. This somber and well-maintained memorial was recently damaged during Russian indiscriminate bombing, which could serve as a powerful symbol of this moment. And the proven Russian war tactics of targeting civilians and infrastructure has created the worst refugee crisis, with tens of thousands of Ukrainian Jews being among about 11 million people displaced in the course of this war. And for my part, since the beginning of this war, I've been looking for ways to help my birth country. And at first, my effort was limited to financial contributions towards relieving the humanitarian crisis and towards military victory of Ukraine. But that didn't feel enough. So I kept looking for ways to add to those efforts. Then through some social media contacts, I learned of the experience of one of my friends who took time off work and went to Poland to help with the huge flow of refugees fleeing from the war zone into that country. Actually, Poland welcomed them with open hearts, despite the difficulties transporting and settling them. And then refugees already counted in the millions, which of course created huge logistical problems. So that friend of mine rented a large van and went to the border to help transport people, and I meant to replicate that. Then I also learned of the plight of the family of my dear childhood friend, whose son suffers from asthma and epilepsy, with the frequency of those seizures having increased due to the constant sleep interruptions related to the frequent air raids. So I put together a GoFundMe page and managed to raise some funds to purchase the medicine that the boy urgently needed. And I must say that in general, I was overwhelmed with the outpouring of support from many of my American friends and their friends, complete strangers to me, with whom I just shared my plans without soliciting any financial contributions beyond that GoFundMe page. And yet, in the short period of time, I managed to raise some significant funds, all of which I used for this important cause. And the contributions actually continued to flow in until I left for my trip, and more so after the unexpected interview we gave to a local TV station, which learned of my plans. Then more contacts developed, and I got in touch with a group of Australian-born volunteers, which was raising funds from their home country to purchase and deliver military supplies to the front lines in Ukraine. And they asked me to purchase some helmets and bulletproof vests that by then were already difficult to obtain anywhere in Europe. So my brother and I and some friends obliged. We managed to create an account at a chain of military stores here and deliver those supplies to the group's base in Warsaw. And while in Warsaw, we explored the city, which was celebrating Ukraine everywhere, and also visited some somber Jewish sites, such as the last remaining ghetto wall and the old Jewish cemetery. And then I made another interesting discovery of a group based on the Polish-Ukrainian border and composed of the Russian dissidents and fugitives from their draconian laws, and as well as former Russian and Soviet citizens like myself, who had their mission helping Ukrainian refugees crossing the border as well as those in need of reaching it, and even fighters on the front lines. And by then, the group counted in hundreds, constantly rotating with people flocking in from dozens of countries to help. And after passing the screening process, needed to filter out potential Russian infiltrators, I was happily accepted into their flames. And then that group rented a very large house right on the border and made a dormitory out of it, with people rotating their sleeping times, the same beds, depending on their shifts. And they also set up tents in the backyard of that house. So in the images here, you see one of the nightly sessions that they had held to plan the group's activities the next day, as well as sorting the supplies around that house. And the picture below, it's a center of humanitarian aid, which was converted from a large shopping mall in that city of Przemysl. It featured large sleeping quarters for the refugees and children's facilities, free food provided 24/7 to both refugees and volunteers like myself by World Central Kitchen, and representatives of about a dozen countries assigned to provide support and welcome the refugees. So as part of my mission while working at this center, I was greeting the new arrivals and going from country to country, helping them communicate. And in the process, I learned of many heartbreaking stories of the plight of those people and the generosity of other nations who offered real support in accepting and settling refugees, including free transportation, accommodations, schooling, and then job placements. So during my stay in Poland, I developed some relationship with some wonderful people that I expect will last me a lifetime, as well as visited some amazing sites, such as this synagogue in the old Jewish quarter of Krakow, and Otto Schindler Museum, which was amazing and heartbreaking and inspirational. So it was truly some of the most meaningful and memorable time of my life. And I'm going back soon. I'm actually studying Polish now to help me with that mission. And also my brother, who also went that way and spent a few weeks there after me, and I are also setting up a charitable organization to help those people and refugees further. And we're partnering with the volunteer group that we worked with. So I think I will end it at this. Sorry, it took a bit longer than I expected, and you may have expected.
Aliza, I can offer a little bit of music, but I really want to give time for people to ask questions that they might have. And I don't want to push us too late.
I want you to at least address the Yiddish theater question.
Sure. Happy to. So happy to, and maybe I'll like offer one thing, to kind of wrap us up. But all that is to say that I could have done, I could do like a whole multi-hour thing on just music that comes from this region, Jewish music that comes from this region of the world. But to answer the question about Yiddish theater music in particular, Goldfaden, who was considered to be the father of Yiddish theater. Oh gosh, he was born in I'm not going to be able to pronounce this, Starokonstantinov, which was then Russian Empire, today present day Ukraine, but he spent a lot of his adult life in Odessa. It's where he met Shalom Aleichem, and he had the Yiddish poet, not the folk figure. He had a cousin who was a pianist, and he ended up interacting with people like Mark Warshavsky, who was another Yiddish poet and songwriter in that area. And it was later, and he wrote his first two plays, which were Die zwei Schönes, The Two Good Neighbors, and Die Morne Zosfe, Aunt Susie. And it was he then eventually moved to present day Romania and like founded a theater troupe. But his roots, his music roots, and his playwriting roots were in his earlier adult life in Odessa, and a number of figures, Yiddish theater and Yiddish poets, had their roots in this part of the world. So Sholem Sekunda was who was another Yiddish theater composer, famous for writing the song "By Mir Bist Du Shein," was born in the Kherson Governorate of the Russian Empire, then present-day Ukraine. Alexander Olshanetsky was of Lithuanian descent, but was born in Odessa. And Boris Tomaszewski, another huge figure in Yiddish theater, was born in near Kiev, actually. So all that is to say is that a lot of Yiddish theater could trace its roots. The music certainly could trace its roots to this region of the world. I wanted to share with you something that is multi-layered. And it's a very familiar tune, but it just shows how music is still resonating with the souls of the Jews who live in this part of the world, and in a really real and meaningful way. Some of you may have seen this video. I had all other things that we could take a look at another time. Two young folks singing in Kharkiv in February, singing a text, incidentally, that was adapted from the writings of a Ukrainian rabbi, Rav Nachman of Bratslav.
No sound.
There's no sound.
Oh, so I forgot to share with sound. That's why. Let's try that one more time. more, and you'll know the tune. The tune came later. The tune was written in 1973 after the Yom Kippur War in Israel, but the text is really resonant. And so that melody is not a Ukrainian melody. That is an Israeli melody by Rabbi Baruch Haidt. If I were to attribute and to superimpose a melody that actually is of Ukrainian origin, there is a nigun that is attributed to Rabbi Levi Yitzchak of Berdichev, who was a 18th century, he died in 1809, so most of his life 18th century rabbi who was the rabbi of Berdichev, which is a town in modern day Ukraine. And so if I were to attribute his melody to these words or to superimpose it, I might sing it this way. Hey ay hey ay hey ay hey ay hey ay hey ay 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 כל העולם כולו, כל העולם כולו, גשר צר מאוד. כל העולם כולו, כל העולם כולו, גשר צר מאוד. והכלל והעיקר לא לפחד כלל, והכלל והעיקר לא לפחד כלל. כל העולם כולו, כל העולם כולו, גשר צר מאוד. כל העולם כולו, כל העולם כולו, גשר צר מאוד. There could be much more, but I think that I'll leave it there for this evening. And let there be time for anybody who has questions from our other lovely speakers and contributors.
Does anyone have a question? Boris had to step out. Does anyone have any questions for Carol, for Cantor Nami? I did see, Eve, your question, which I think is much better directed at Boris about what we can do now.
Oh, I understand that. That's
And so I will connect with Boris and share his response to that question along with the recording from this so that you can all more slowly process all of that history.
you know, we think of ourselves as American Jews, but when we hear about Ukraine and the names of the villages, we realize we're not so American. We're really from the Pale, and it hurts. And so this was very, very useful information, although it's very sad. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
seeing no other questions, I am going to stop the recording, but you are welcome to stay on and chat and say hello. Thank you to Carol. Thank you to Kendra Namey. Thank you to Boris. Thank you to the whole committee that helped brainstorm this. At least some of you are on screen. Vivian, Lynn Baesta, Marilyn, Julie. I'm sure I'm forgetting somebody on that team. Thank you all for making tonight happen.
Thank you too. Very, very informative, very sad.
What I would love to share with folks, not to listen to or sing now, but in 2018 there was a phenomenal concert that was done through the Jewish Music Research Center at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem called Odessa Mama. It was Jewish soundscapes of Odessa. There's phenomenal recordings of a lot of the 3 different kinds of categories of music that I spoke to earlier. I'm going to put the link in our chat, and maybe if anybody's maybe Eliza, if you're going to be saving the chat, you might find a way to share this with
Sure.
with folks another time. So again, it was a concert that was done in 2018, featuring 2 soloists, Cantor Ozzy Schwartz of Park Avenue Synagogue in New York, and a really phenomenal Yiddish singer, Vera Lozinski. So I leave that for you all to enjoy at your leisure.
I'd like to mention, if I might, that today is my parents' 115th anniversary. And my mother was born in Ukraine in about the same time as Paul Cantor's.
Grandmother.
Yes, but and she was born in a little town called Luban. They called it, the Jews called it Luban. The Ukrainians call it Lubny, and it's in Poltava, at the gubernia of Poltava. I just wanted to share that with you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's Janet. I was going to mention, I recently discovered the town that had been part of Poland in 1909 when my dad was born, but is currently part of Ukraine. I found his birth certificate. So he's born in the town of Volanka, which is near Borislav. And it's a Jewish birth certificate, so it's actually very interesting. It you know, says who the witnesses were for the bris and things like that on it. The question I have is, are there any remnants at all of those small towns of Judaism? You know, so like the town my dad was born in is still on a Ukrainian map, but would any remnants of Judaism have been totally destroyed by the end of World War II? And you know, like, where do Jews live now who are still in Ukraine? Are they all in the cities? And
I can't answer about where people live, but I can answer that the grave of the Baal Shem Tov has been restored, and a restored building has been built in that town, Medjugorje, that I showed you on the Google map, for people to visit. I don't know about other places that didn't have notable figures who came from there.
yeah, so the question is, you know, if one went back to visit the town in which your ancestors came from, would there be any remnants of any Jewish life having existed there in the past, or did it all get wiped out and exterminated in the interim?
There are probably parts of cemeteries or gravestones having been repurposed for other buildings.
I can say my grandfather on my father's side was born in Berdyshev outside Kiev. And I went, oh, I wonder what's there now. And you can find it. I don't remember if I went to, Google or something like that, but there was a little thing that said, what if you went to Berdyshev, what would you want to go see? And one of the three things listed was the Jewish cemetery.
So that townland of Berdichev, that is a very famous center of Jewish learning and music as well, particularly amongst the Hasidic Jews. As I mentioned before, the nigun that I sang just a little bit before was by Rabbi Levi Yitzchak of Berdichev, who was one of the great Hasidic rabbis.
Well, evidently at one time that town was about 75% Jewish. Mm-hmm. And so that presumably is why the Jewish cemetery had a major presence there and is still there and visited by folks.
But to sort of touch the edge of Janet's question, I would say, not to say that you won't find Jews in some of these towns, but by and large, most of them have gravitated toward the urban centers in the former Soviet Union. During the first year of seminary at HUC, first year students who are studying in Israel are often encouraged around Pesach to actually go to communities in the former Soviet Union to help lead Passover Seders, as ways of kind of helping Jewish communities that are trying to kind of reestablish themselves especially in those urban centers. Had a great interaction with some folks, a Jewish just a couple of Jews from a progressive community in Warsaw, where they were talking about the kind of revival of Jewish community life there. And they spoke too about this interesting remnant. We were talking about cemeteries, but another remnant that's very interesting in certain towns in Poland, such as Warsaw, is that the way that they would affix mezuzot in those times is that they would actually, they weren't on top of the surface of the doorpost. They were recessed into the doorpost. Mm-hmm. And you can still find the imprints of those mezuzot in many of those structures. And there's some company recently that started actually making castings from those imprints and making new mezuzot from the imprints.
And where is that?
This was in Warsaw, I believe, at least where they were getting these castings from structures in Warsaw, Poland.
Linda,
Yes.
is the city that you're referencing also pronounced Berdichev?
Well, the cantor pronounced it. We'll go back to him and.
I've always just heard people refer to the rabbi who's from there as, Levi Yitzchak of Berdichev. That's just how I've heard people say
Berdichev, it probably is. It's in the Zhytomyr, I don't know, county or oblast.
Zhytomyr.
Zhytomyr.
Yeah. Another famous rabbi's from there. I know that the rabbis who are from those, the Hasidic rabbis who are from those places. So Zev Wolf of Zhytomyr was another well-known Hasidic teacher.
Yeah. So
my mother's family's name was Zhytomirsky. So.
Really? Well, I guess we kind of have an idea of where they might have been from at one point.
I wanted to mention something I learned in the course of working on this presentation about Jewish life in Ukraine today. And it's not about the remains of small towns. It's about what the Chabad movement is doing in Ukraine. They have 100 rabbis. They have built a massive Jewish center in Dnipro on the river. through the generosity of several Jewish oligarchs. And you know, as we know, the Chabad organization is very connected around the world, and they may be accomplishing something that in the end will increase the number of Jews in Ukraine. And another fact that I've been aware of for a while, and you learn this when you look into Zelensky's own biography, is that in the Soviet Union, people would retain their personal identity as Jews, but they knew nothing about how to be Jewish. And so the Chabad folks are taking one approach to teaching them, and it will surely take a long time for more people to identify in a meaningful way other than what it says on their passport, which is how it was in the Soviet Union.
Well, in some ways, that program that I mentioned that HUC did of sending folks to the former Soviet Union for Pesach was from a similar motive, right? To help some of these communities that knew nothing of Jewish practice and wanted to try to reestablish some of those practices.
Right.
Friends, I have to sign off for the evening. We have kindergarten orientation tomorrow morning.
Thank you, Cantor.
Thank you all. Have a great evening.
Good evening.
I also invite you to turn in for the amazing shofar race and hear the shofar for the.
Oh, absolutely. Yes, where we're gonna land eventually. I don't know. Can I give it away that there's gonna be some sweet treats
Yes, you can.
at the end.
Yes, you
Chocolate
can.
shop.
There will be ice cream.
Yes,
the
indeed.
race ends with ice cream.
And shofar to bring in the month of Elul, this season that we're entering. So,
And
have
you
a good evening.
Good evening.
You can
Carol,
register to hear the shofar on Zoom.
Carol Cantor, thank you very much for the research and the information you shared. Take care.
Very
Thanks.
good. Thank you all.
Good night.
It was fabulous.
Night.
Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you.